Lots of problems can arise if characters in lettering and numbering look ambiguous, that is, if they could be mistaken for each other. And so you might never have thought about this, but that's one of the reasons that characters on license plates, like ones, are printed differently than I's. And also it tends to be the case that numerals and letters get put in different parts of license plates. So even if there was, for example, an O and a 0 on the same license plate, context clues would let you know what the license plate number was. However, this can be a really big problem for scientists when they're, for example, writing out lab notebooks or printing numerals and letters onto packaging, for example, say samples that you might have stored in a freezer or something like that. So the purpose of today's video is to introduce a set of characters that you can use that are unambiguous. They're hard to mistake for other letters and numbers. I encourage you all to write your uppercase letters like this. And your lowercase letters thus. And your numerals And now let me tell you why I think this is the perfect alphabet for scientists. So here I've highlighted all of the characters in the English alphabet and numerals that I think could potentially be mistaken for other characters, and then I'm going to show you how I write these characters, the ones that are highlighted in yellow, to make them unambiguous. So let's work top to bottom, left to right. B could potentially be confused for an 8. I've seen some people write some sloppy B's before. So what I like to do is add a little serif, a little extension of that B, which makes it more difficult to confuse with an 8. I also like to write 8s as 2 independent circles, which means that I don't accidentally leave any small serifs that might make that 8 look like a B. Now, capital D can be problematic because depending on who's writing it, whether or not they have sort of bubbly handwriting or clear, crisp handwriting, that might look like an O. So here again, I like to leave serifs on the capital D, right? Little overhangs that suggest that that is not a poorly written 0 or O. So that could be confused for either a 0 or an O unless you do something special to make that capital D stand out. And depending on how you write G's, they might wind up looking like some funny 6s. So again, I prefer to use the serif to make sure that that doesn't look like some weirdly written 6. I's, I think you've already figured out, best to cross the top and the bottom of the capital I. O's, there's nothing to do with O's, but the way I distinguish them from zeros is I cross my zeros. S's are insidious. This is probably the worst thing that can happen. Some S's, depending on who's writing them, can look like 5s. So S I don't do anything to, but 5s, I add that little serif across the top to make it look a little bit more like a 5 and not necessarily an S. That may be an extreme example. There. It also helps if you drop that vertical line a little bit. You just want to make sure you don't connect them because then it looks like a 6. Sevens, depending on who's writing them, can look like 1s or I's. For example, if a capital I was written, if the numeral 1 was written like that, that could look like a 7 depending on how hastily somebody's writing them. So I prefer to cross my 7s. That distinguishes them from 1s and other characters that might look similar. Lowercase l's, there's not really anything to do. They're the one, for me, that are just a stick, and that distinguishes them from capital I's, numeral 1s, and numeral 7s. What else do we have? U's and V's depending again on who's writing them and how curvy their handwriting are, can be mistaken. So I prefer to serif the tail of the U, just in case the point on the bottom of the V isn't clear. And to distinguish Z's from numeral 2's, I prefer to cross them. So again, I cross 7's and Z's to make them distinct characters that are not ambiguous with numerals. And numeral 2's, to make sure they don't be confused from Z's, I like to give a little loop in the bottom of the number 2. Lowercase g might accidentally look like a numeral 9, again, depending on how hastily people are writing it. So I do like to give that serif and make the tail very curvy, whereas when I write 9's, I make the tail straight to help distinguish that from lowercase g's. Now there's an interesting thing about the numeral 4. In most fonts, at least the 2 fonts I've showed you today, the 4 is written as shown here, but I tend to write my 4's rather, with an open top. That prevents them from accidentally looking like a numeral 9, depending again on how curvy, oh, that was horrible, depending again on how curvy your handwriting is. You could see that a 4 hastily written might look like a 9, and we don't want that. In terms of lowercase h and n, the big problem here is how high you draw that serif. So I really like to make the h stand out and make the n minimal. There's not much more you can do about those two characters. Q's, depending on who writes them, could look like 9's, lowercase q's. So it's really important to give them that curvy flipped tail to distinguish them from numeral 9. Again, lowercase s's and uppercase s's don't get distinguished from each other, but they could look like 5's. We already discussed that. T's, lowercase, can look like pluses, which is why I like this font is already drawn. I like to give the bottom of the T a tail. U's and V's, lowercase, are distinguished by the presence or the absence of that serif, the tail of the U, which isn't present in the V. So again, if you have somebody that's a curvy letter writer, they might write their V's with sort of a curvy bottom. That can be ambiguous with a lowercase u. There are lots of uses of x's, especially, well, lower or uppercase. It's hard to tell which is lowercase and which is uppercase. But in print, I like to make my x curvy to distinguish it from a multiplication symbol, for example. And lowercase z's, like uppercase z's, I also cross to make sure they don't look like number 2. Now I have a couple of special additions, and those are Greek letters, which can be ambiguous. Beta, I like to give a lowercase beta. I like to give a long tail, and likewise, and most importantly for lots of biologists and chemists, mu, the lowercase Greek mu, depending on how long you make that initial tail, can look an awful lot like a lowercase m, depending on that tail. So those are really easy to not be able to distinguish from each other, and we're talking about the difference between microns and millis, right? So 10 to the minus 6 and 10 to the minus 3. That's a really important distinction to make. So I do encourage making that tail on the lowercase mu exceptionally long.